This is Pamela 2.0, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by Connor Brannigan. Technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. Christian Luce Lang. Chapter 1. With only 3 minutes of the pre-9 a.m. delivery window remaining, and with Simon Biker's patience stretching to limits he'd never thought possible, the sudden chiming of a two-tone doorbell sent him scurrying across the floor like a cat on an ice rink. Simon gladly abandoned the unusually elaborate breakfast that lay on his counter, one he had prepared in an effort to distract his excited mind from fixating on the ticking of the clock and the non-ringing of the doorbell. Now that the time had finally come, now that the package had finally come, food was the last thing on his mind. Yanking the door open as though trying to escape from a burning vehicle, Simon startled the doorman, who stood with a shoebox-sized package in his hands. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Biker," the man said, smiling as the initial surprise wore off. "The courier did tell me you'd be eagerly awaiting this." "Sorry, Charles," Simon laughed. "Didn't mean to jump out at you like that, but yeah, I've been counting down the seconds until 9 a.m., and then I would have been ready to start sending some emails." Charles, who had come to know Simon fairly well during his 4 years in the building, handed over the package without another word. His expression asked the question his professionalism prevented him from speaking aloud, but the curiosity was so evident that Simon didn't need to hear it. "It's a Pamela 2.0, the very first prototype to leave the lab." Simon beamed, childlike wonder and enthusiasm dripping from every syllable. "I've got 48 hours to—" A hint of movement on the other side of the marble-floored hallway caught Simon's attention, momentarily piercing his focused excitement. The source was his young neighbor, Joe, for whom he had very little time. The teenager, subtle as a kick in the groin, was evidently attempting to eavesdrop on the delivery and had cracked his front door open far enough for Simon to see his face. This lasted all of a few seconds, until Joe accepted defeat and pulled the door closed as conspicuously as he had opened it. "His father is relocating to Switzerland permanently in a few months," Charles whispered, leaning in toward Simon's ear. "We won't have to deal with the boy for much longer." All of this was news to Simon. As professional and discreet as Charles typically was, though, a crucial trait for the doorman of such an exclusive building, there was little surprise in hearing him pass implicit judgment on young Joe Poole. In recent years, Joe had conducted himself in a manner many might have expected from the 19-year-old son of one of the wealthiest men in the country, and no one would be sad to see the back of them. The noise and the parties wouldn't be missed, and nor would the police visits, but for Simon, it was a lot more personal than that. The one thing he had in common with Joe, 10 years his junior, was that neither paid their own way into what was quite possibly the country's most desirable residential building. The key difference in Simon's mind was that he had at least been chosen as a living mate by Caitlin Judd, the Hollywood starlet who he was lucky enough to count as his long-term girlfriend. Joe Poole, on the other hand, was an albatross around the neck of his financier father. Joe had been a real pain in Simon's neck, and on occasion even more so in Caitlin's. The biggest issue arose when Simon discovered the boys snapping creep shots of Caitlin in the elevator, on a rare occasion when they'd been using it at the same time. Only Caitlin's insistent pleas stopped Simon from dispensing his feelings, and given the boy's tender age at the time, he was, in hindsight, very glad of that. Joe was sporting a black eye the next time Simon saw him, in any case, suggesting that his mortally embarrassed father had been serious in promising he would make sure nothing of the sort ever happened again. To date, this promise had been upheld, with Joe's more recent misbehavior being altogether less personal and of a kind that equally annoyed the rest of his neighbors, and apparently their doorman, as much as it annoyed Simon. The camera phone incident had been almost 4 years ago, but the feelings remained raw given the level of understandable anger Caitlin and Simon had both felt over such a brazen invasion of privacy in the one place she was supposed to be free from the gutter-dwelling paparazzi. Just as he did today, back then Joe had awkwardly retreated to his apartment with his tail between his legs after just a few seconds of intense eye contact from Simon. Now, with the hallway once again their own, Simon and his loyal doorman chatted briefly about the remarkable prototype that had just been handed over. Charles, like almost everyone else, knew all about the infamous failure of the original Pamela device, a hand-shaped helper bot that some spoke of as a uniquely shaped gadget of the future, and others derided as an absolute abomination. A dismembered hand that crawled around spider-like on its fleshy fingers did look like something from a horror movie, as Simon not only recognized but outright stated in his initial review a year earlier. That review had been one of several to skewer the much-hyped device, now referred to by its creators as Pamela 1.0. But Simon's unique position as a hugely popular online influencer meant that his negative opinion counted more than any other and proved fatal for the gadget's pre-launch momentum. As soon as Pamela 2.0 was ready, Simon had been offered an exclusive 48-hour test run of the first-ever prototype. Its creators made highly public proclamations that they were so confident in the improvements made since Pamela 1.0, they wanted to give its biggest critic the first chance to see the extent of the improvements they had made. It was scant exaggeration to say that the project's whole future depended on the nature of the review Simon would post after his 48-hour test. The multi-billion-dollar Globo TechNow Corporation stock price had fluctuated wildly in the week leading up to Simon's test run, with investor sentiment seeming to rest on nothing more than readings into his mood based on unrelated social media posts. His own stock had risen exponentially since meeting Caitlin on the set of a TV commercial, one she was filming for a company who employed him as a tech advisor at the time. But for Simon, this didn't even make the top 10 list of benefits in dating one of the world's most desirable women. He counted himself lucky every single day. Today, though, with Caitlin filming on location in Europe, Simon counted himself lucky to now be in possession of what was surely the most desired prototype in the world, Pamela 2.0. Simon wasn't and never had been in the tech game for money. Passion had always been his driver. The fact that he was now so comfortable, both with the Caitlin connection and the enormous online following it had helped him to build, brought an extra degree of credibility to his opinions. Put simply, and unlike countless influencers and even online news outlets, Simon Biker couldn't be bought. Whether he would go on to post a positive or negative review of the Pamela 2.0 prototype that had just been delivered, the world would know he truly believed every single word of it. An alarm suddenly blared from Simon's phone, signaling 9 a.m. and the start of his 48-hour test. He lifted it from his pocket and silenced the tone. "I'll leave you to it," Charles said. "Enjoy." Simon nodded and looked down at the box. "Thanks, Charles. One way or another, it's going to be interesting for sure." Chapter 2. With his priceless Pamela 2.0 prototype in hand, Simon Biker walked through his airy apartment and headed straight for his office. He left his breakfast where it lay, food could wait, and paused only to pick up his phone charger from the counter. He took a second to type a quick message to Caitlin, letting her know it had finally arrived, then left their expensive living area for the preferred confines of his office. Not by accident, this looked a lot like his teenage bedroom, or at least like his teenage bedroom would have looked like if he had been able to fill its shelves and display cases with the plethora of comic book and movie memorabilia that now graced his walls. 2 large monitors and a small wireless keyboard were the only items on his well-organized desk unit, while a powered treadmill lay at its base to help ward off the potential ill effects of his largely sedentary life. Today, though, a chair was in order. Simon lifted a folding chair from behind the desk and put it in place, ready for his long-awaited unboxing. Directly in his eye line, an Ultra HD camera was inset in the wall to capture the popular video blogs and reviews Simon posted on a daily basis. He opened his mouth and did a few facial stretching exercises through sheer force of habit, before consciously remembering that there would be no live stream or even video recording of this unboxing. The level of interest the social media blitz behind Pamela 2.0's recent unveiling generated at a consumer electronics convention would have comfortably assured record-breaking viewing figures, but Simon knew the rules. He was under the strictest of embargoes for the duration of his 48-hour test, and even when it expired, he would only be permitted to discuss his views in written format for the next 5 days. Globo Tech Now, or GTN for short, had placed a great deal of trust in Simon in this regard, and he was in no mind to go back on his word. The embargo was even more frustrating for his hordes of followers, all of whom were desperately eager to learn more about a gadget that looked as though it might really correct Pamela 1.0's critical flaws, and not just deliver on, but exceed the almost unlimited promise of that original product. Simon hesitated as his hands hovered over the sealed package, experiencing an "if a tree falls in the woods" moment as he tried to remember the last time he had unboxed something without an audience. Unlike most of his young followers, though, Simon had grown up in an era before everything was broadcast for the world to see, and could at least think back to those warm memories of Christmases gone by. He remembered tearing off the wrapping paper like a child possessed, usually evoking laughter from his mother and warnings not to break what was inside from his father. Both parents were now greatly proud of his success, and had been when it was a lot more moderate prior to his lightning bolt of luck in catching Caitlin Judd's eye, even if neither could pretend to understand modern children's fascination with watching other people open boxes. Simon could only laugh at the particular bemusement on his father's face when he once explained that a lot of children now watched videos of other people reacting to videos of other people opening boxes, taking the abstraction to a level that even Simon struggled with from time to time. One further requirement of the test run, stipulated in the contract, was that all of Simon's home security cameras had to be disabled for the full duration. Pamela 2.0 was a prototype, after all, with certain kinks and small imperfections to be expected. Simon insisted that he would only engage in the test if he was able to honestly describe his experiences in full, and GTN's executives agreed. Their chief concern was preventing the possible dissemination of any footage of the prototype glitching or otherwise failing to complete a task, which could have been taken in isolation and mocked on social media in a manner they understandably deemed a greater risk to the device's reputation than a few lines of text in the cons section of a review they confidently believed would be overwhelmingly positive. The timing of everything worked out perfectly, given that Caitlin was out of town, leaving Simon comfortable enough in disabling the cameras for a few days when he was the only person home and no one else would be coming or going. To date, all that had been publicly revealed relating to Pamela 2.0 was a 15-second ad. Its audience penetration had reached unprecedented levels both online and on TV in the week since its debut, but very few details were known. There was no footage of any household tasks being performed, only an artfully lit shot of the hand-shaped device in its default resting position. This alone highlighted a big change, though, what with the new version being capable of dynamic self-balancing and smooth movement, courtesy of a gyroscopic ball on the base of the wrist section. This was a far more palatable vision than that of Pamela 1.0 crawling around on its stiff fingers, looking every inch the horror movie prop that so many had likened it to. Simon took great care while opening the nondescript outer packaging in which his priceless prototype had been delivered, and upon discarding the cardboard box, he gazed in heightened anticipation at what looked like the final retail packaging. It was beyond rare for a prototype to arrive like this, but Simon knew this was no ordinary prototype. Rumors that hundreds of thousands of units were already manufactured and ready to launch at the drop of a hat suddenly seemed to carry more sway than he'd previously considered, which in turn made him even more excited to start playing around with his new toy. Despite what some people thought, including one outspoken GTN executive, Simon wanted nothing more than to be blown away by Pamela 2.0. His scathing review of the first iteration had been born of desperate disappointment rather than any kind of malice, with the device's slow response times and physical weakness putting a damper on his hopes of tech revolution. There was nothing he wanted more than to spend an enjoyable 48 hours getting to know the new iteration and to end the test with a glowing review. The amount of doubling down that GTN had recently engaged in brought hope once again even to Simon's increasingly industry-cynical heart, with their grandiose promises of world-changing improvements and undreamed-of capabilities rattling around his brain as he delicately opened the minimalistic retail packaging. The remarkable robotic device was cloaked by a protective black cloth, which Simon used to lift it out. He placed it back down on his desk, dock and all, then cut the figure of a stage magician as he whisked away the cloth to reveal what lay underneath. "Whoa," he uttered. "It looks so real." No one was around to hear him, but Simon simply couldn't keep this to himself. He wasn't only comparing Pamela 2.0 to her coarser predecessor either, but rather gazing between the device and his own hand with a feeling of something between awe and unease. The life-sized hand stood in his charging dock with the wrist section on the ground and the palm facing Simon. It had wrinkle lines so convincing that he would have insisted were photoshopped if he wasn't staring at the real thing with his own eyes, and rotating the dock to take a look at the back revealed that Pamela's knuckles and artificial veins were just as uncannily real-looking. GTN promised lifelike, and boy were they delivering. After wiggling his own fingers next to the stationary device for a few seconds, Simon gently touched Pamela's thumb to get a sense of the new material. "Oh," Simon said to himself, pulling his hand away after the briefest of touches as though recoiling from a great heat. This sound was less positive than the first, but not because the contact had felt like skin to fire, however. On the contrary, Simon was amazed and physically surprised by just how much it felt like skin to skin. Simon gulped. It almost felt too real. For the first time, he felt gladness and relief that the unboxing wasn't being streamed or recorded, because this was a reaction he wouldn't have wanted the world to see. Fright was likely a better word than shock to encapsulate his initial feeling, but as it quickly faded, there was only a short while before wonder returned. "So real," he said, still talking aloud without consciously realizing it, and now starting to smile as his fingertips ran across Pamela's artificial skin. Gently bending the fingers and squeezing that skin did bring signs of its artificiality, which at this point was something of a relief to Simon Biker's somewhat confused senses. A further light touch brought back the realness, a realness far beyond what he'd experienced with any other artificial skin, even on the most premium companion dolls he somewhat contemptuously encountered at various tech shows from time to time. The weight of the device was the next thing to surprise Simon, whose mind was by now thinking of it as a hand rather than a mere device. He was also already starting to think that this perhaps truly was going to be what Pamela 1.0 was always supposed to be, the extra helping hand every home could use, as the commercials lauded. Holding this second iteration to judge its weight, he considered that it had to be around 3 times heavier than the first. This was only apparent now that he was holding the hand without its dock, and even more so without the outer packaging, as seeing the size of the hand and feeling its weight really brought home the density of all the high-end components that made it tick. That was where Simon's true interest lay, in seeing just what a compact and autonomous home helper like Pamela 2.0 could really do. While he could fully understand the commercial appeal of a gimmicky helping hand design, part of him had long believed that the limitations inherent to this shape were a necessary compromise, since robot-shaped robots were a big no-no for many consumers, and especially for parents who didn't want their young children growing up around humanoid machines. GTN's limited but superlative Latin press releases about Pamela 2.0 promised all kinds of things that lifelong tech enthusiast Simon Biker could hardly wait to see for himself. As the clock hit 9:04 and his initial physical impressions began to settle, he placed the hand on its dock and pressed the activation button. In a flash of motion far more unnervingly lifelike than any mere touch could ever be, Pamela's outstretched fingers relaxed and repositioned themselves into a perfect thumbs-up gesture. Simon smiled and gulped at the same time. Like the unbottled genies of legends gone by, the hand was out of its box. And whether she would prove more Pandora or Panacea, there was no putting Pamela back in now. Chapter 3. If there was any exaggeration in saying that Simon Biker's first day with Pamela 2.0 was the most incredible of his life, it could only have been a slight one. That he would sleep for only 3 hours at the end of it said a lot. That he would dream only of new ways to test the remarkable gadget said the rest. Simon spent the day running through all of the primary tasks he had accumulated in a notes document since learning of the opportunity. These included some tasks suggested by his millions of followers, some that Pamela 1.0 had disappointingly failed to perform around a year earlier, and some that Simon himself had devised to push the second iteration to its limits. In the same way Simon quickly came to think of the device as a hand, it didn't take long for his mind to reframe Pamela as a she rather than an it. Some of this was perhaps down to the sheer number of times he said the name Pamela over the course of the day, what with it necessarily preceding every direct instruction. This didn't take any getting used to. Like most others, Simon was already accustomed to addressing far less impressive and less intelligent digital assistants in a similar manner. But it certainly played a part in making Pamela seem less robotic. The hand-shaped helper's name was an obvious play on Pamela having a passing oral resemblance to Palm, but the name was crucially also a soft and pleasant one. No one could deny that it comfortably beat GTN's second-placed fallback option for the name, Dexter, a less elegant nod towards dexterity and a much harsher-sounding name that couldn't possibly have helped the product's chances of success. The name of the remarkable hand that spent the day performing jaw-dropping tasks and even a few stunts within Simon's apartment was the furthest thing from his conscious mind, however, with actions speaking much louder than words ever could, and with the stunned amazement at what he saw leaving little room in his brain for any other thoughts. Right after he first activated Pamela and marveled at the smoothness of her thumbs-up gesture, Simon wasted little time in getting to the task he'd been looking forward to challenging her with most of all. There was no warm-up, no gradual build through a series of progressively more challenging tasks. Instead, Simon threw down the gauntlet with a task that had proven damagingly impossible for the 1.0 version that still lay in a box under his desk. On the face of it, the task seemed unfair. It would have struck most observers as patently absurd to expect a hand-shaped robot to do what Simon requested, but he had all along considered it perfectly reasonable given the lofty claims GTN liked to make about Pamela's ability to perform all those cumbersome household tasks that people would rather delegate than handle for themselves. Simon had never sought to catch Pamela 1.0 out and wasn't trying to catch Pamela 2.0 out either. He simply wanted to test the limits of their abilities. Every part of him wanted the hand to succeed in every task he assigned, and this was never more true than when the new iteration set about tackling the challenge that stumped its forerunner. More amusingly, he also hoped it would provide a new answer to the question posed by several different commentators when Pamela 1.0 was first announced. How many robot hands does it take to change a light bulb? It was a great first test for all kinds of reasons, chief among them that it provided an opportunity for the new hand to showcase many of its physical abilities in quick succession. It began with a simple order. Pamela, change the light bulb. Simon presented a new light bulb as he made the request, then pointed to the one he wanted Pamela to switch it with. From there, the recently activated hand re-extended her fingers from the thumbs-up position and turned them towards the overhead light fixture like flower stems turning to the sun. Each of Pamela's fingertips, as well as her palm and the back of her hand, housed remarkably acute visual sensors. Promotional materials boasted that her vision was sharper than an eagle's and as effective in the dark as any nocturnal animal. Pamela's eyes, as it were, studied her surroundings constantly and fed the data into a local processor that was more powerful than any publicly available computers. None of the processing or decision-making was handled remotely or dependent on an internet connection. Pamela 2.0 was a truly self-contained home helper. She has the eyes of an eagle feeding data to a brain greater than that of any man who ever lived, as a GTN spokesman once said. And that's just for starters. One early improvement Simon noticed in the new iteration was that Pamela's fingernails now changed color to relay the status of her request. The nails of her second and fourth fingers turned green within a second of Simon's light bulb request, informing him that the request had been understood, and her middle fingernail was flashing blue to relay that information gathering was underway. He knew from a quick glance at the accompanying manual that the flashing blue nail would turn one of 3 steady colors before long. Green would indicate that the task had been deemed possible and, crucially, also safe, with Pamela ready to get to work immediately. Red would indicate a rejection of the request, usually on safety or legal grounds, but also if the task was deemed inappropriate, which in turn usually related to the rule that Pamela could in no circumstances put herself in physical contact with any human. A steady orange fingernail, in Simon's mind the most likely result, would indicate that Pamela was willing to try the task but couldn't confidently assert that she would complete it. Last time out, back when the less equipped Pamela 1.0 had been unable to communicate in this simple but effective way, she had attempted the challenge and failed at the first hurdle of reaching the bulb that was already in place. When Simon had then pointed to a lamp rather than a ceiling light, Pamela 1.0 maneuvered herself into position but failed to remove the halogen bulb from its fixture. Today, however, a few seconds of deliberation was all it took for Pamela 2.0 to decide that replacing the light bulb hanging from Simon's 16-foot-high ceiling was within her power. As the hand's middle fingernail turned steady green, he sat comfortably in his chair and got ready for the show. "I'll believe it when I see it," he said, hoping he would, but certainly not counting on it. The color-changing fingernails added chameleon to the list of animals for Pamela's comparison menagerie, along with eagle and spider for starters. And fish, Simon thought to himself, since she was now entirely waterproof. In any event, Pamela 2.0's instruction manual also explained that she was fluently adept at one-handed sign language, but Simon's own lack of knowledge on that front meant that the claim would go untested for now. An impressively quick learner, she had already abandoned all attempts to communicate with Simon using standardized sign language without giving him any suspicion that it was ever under consideration. His failure to reply to her early sign language greetings and a follow-up question left her constantly improving AI brain in no doubt that he was oblivious to the gestures, and thus that any more would be wasted on him. For that reason, Pamela instead stuck to more rudimentary gestures like the universally understood thumbs up or down, as well as a come hither motion which clearly represented an invitation for further clarifying information. Combined with the fingernails, this was a sufficient amount of visual feedback for Simon. Since another selling point for Pamela was the potentially life-changing help she could offer individuals with various kinds and levels of disabilities or impairments, non-visual feedback was possible too. Simon planned to link Pamela up to his home's existing smart speaker network on day 2, once he had really tested her capacity for understanding instructions and pushed her physical limitations. Most consumers stated that they didn't want a device that talked to them, and especially not one that had to be linked up to other elements of a network, so the promise of spoken conversation, while admittedly interesting, didn't excite Simon as much as the core questions of what Pamela could do and understand. Indeed, GTN had been open in stating that their extensive market research showed that most consumers were either exhausted by or untrusting of the so-called smart home revolution as a whole, with only a small cohort of enthusiasts ever having turned their homes into the hyper-connected environments that were once predicted to be ubiquitous. That was why Pamela 1.0 was never presented as another smart device, and why this point had been made even clearer in the pre-marketing buzz surrounding Pamela 2.0. Every home could use another helping hand, as the highly effective slogan said. The number of homeowners who would value a robotic helper capable of running them a perfect bath and refilling the cat's food bowl was said to be far greater than the number who would readily trust such tasks to internet-connected control systems, and Simon could understand why. As someone who made his living in the field of consumer technology, or at least someone who had done so back in the days when earning a living was something he had to worry about, many might have expected Simon Biker to live in a home bursting with interconnected smart devices. On the contrary, however, Simon saw himself as someone who knew far too much about the dangers of inviting such things into his home to ever allow it. A recent spate of high-profile incidents of hacking and privacy abuses, particularly involving celebrities, had woken more people up to these issues than ever before. The stage seemed set for a product like Pamela to take advantage of these misgivings, and what Simon was about to see would hopefully make him as sure could be that in this iteration she would finally be able to live up to GTN's long-standing hype. How much of that hype was justified was soon to be learned, Simon considered, and how much hype lived on was soon to depend largely on his review. He wanted Pamela to succeed in his initial light bulb challenge as well as every other to follow, and he held his breath as she began to carry it out after telling him she was capable. Just a few seconds later, Simon began to understand why Pamela 2.0 was so much heavier than the first iteration. The hand rolled to the edge of his desk, effortlessly gliding across the surface thanks to the new and highly adaptive rollerball-like feature at the base of its wrist. This method of movement was much more pleasant to watch than the finger-based spider crawl of old, when Pamela 1.0 did the 5-fingered equivalent of tiptoeing from one place to another. But what came next was both more incredible to watch and more spider-like than Simon would ever have believed. Having sized up her target, Pamela 2.0 bent her 3 central fingers and then explosively re-extended them. It took Simon a few seconds to understand what was happening and a few more to truly accept that he was seeing it, as each of the 3 fingertips suddenly projected a strand of extremely fine metallic web, for lack of a better word, in the direction of the light fitting. Simon's mouth fell open in amazement. This superhero-esque ability was perfectly in keeping with the memorabilia that filled the office in which Pamela was making her powers known, and the result looked like something between a propelled grappling hook and a spider web. To his further surprise, however, Pamela hadn't lassoed her web-like projection around the fitting. Even more impressively, she had revealed the web-like material to be as adhesive as a real spider's and equally capable of sustaining her not insufficient weight. The web retracted back into her fingertips, carrying her entire mass upwards as though the ceiling was a child and she was its favorite yo-yo. Her fingertips then clung to the ceiling like a spider's legs, allowing her to crawl effortlessly towards the bulb Simon had pointed to. A second and smaller web then allowed her to descend gently for a few inches until she landed on the bulb, at which point her fingers gripped onto it and unscrewed it from the fitting. Simon watched silently as Pamela grasped the bulb with her thumb and 3 fingers before her pinky projected a new diagonal line of web. Simon could now think of the material as nothing else, towards a clear area of his desk. Pamela cast the figure of a zipliner as she descended with the light bulb in her grasp. She placed it down and picked up the replacement without delay, carrying it back to the ceiling using the same line of web as her chosen method of transport. Seconds later, the new bulb was in place. Pamela's 3 central fingernails emitted all the colors of the rainbow in a quick succession, reporting and celebrating on a task safely completed. "Incredible," Simon said. "But now, just to see... Pamela, this time can you climb the wall using just your fingers, no web climbing, then cross the ceiling and come down again the same way?" 3 green fingernails said yes. Simon watched as she climbed rapidly, something about the movement of her fingers now evoking the tentacles of an octopus as well as the legs of a spider. This was impressive without being stunning relative to what Simon had already seen, but what came next was positively remarkable. Seemingly having overinterpreted the request for what to do this time, Pamela again descended to the light bulb once her fingertip suction carried her upside down across the ceiling. After unscrewing the bulb, Pamela then proceeded to wrap it so densely in a web that Simon could barely see what it was. Completing the amazing spectacle, Pamela crawled back along the ceiling using her thumb and 3 fingers, while the bulb dangled below via a web coming solely from her pinky. It was a sight to behold. Once back on solid ground, Pamela retracted her web and gave the "job done" rainbow light show one more time as Simon stared in disbelief. "Can you take a photo of me?" Simon asked a few hours later, in which time Pamela had aced every test that came her way. He put his phone on the desk, inviting her to take it. Pamela's central fingernails displayed 3 steady green signs of affirmation that she both could and would perform this new task. She rolled to the desk from her last position on the floor, then used her fingers' adaptive suction-like powers of adhesion to climb up to the surface, and carefully took hold of the phone. Simon rose to his feet. "Take it from head height," he requested, trusting her not to drop his phone and unsure whether she would project another web-like spire onto the ceiling and suspend herself from that, or whether she might climb the wall to the appropriate height. This was a request that Pamelas around the world were sure to hear endlessly from owners seeking better angles than selfies could provide, and it had, perhaps unsurprisingly, been one of the tasks which received the most test requests from Simon's loyal followers. By then he should have known better than to be surprised, but the sight of a metallic pole steadily extending from Pamela's wrist stump until it lifted her to Simon's eye line ensured that the photo she captured was of a man smiling in wonder. The pole had no multi-legged balancing mechanism at the bottom and looked instead to rely on powerful web-like adhesion to stay in place. Simon asked Pamela to stay put once the photo was taken, seeking his chance to explore the remarkable pole up close. He found that it was hollow, seemingly composed of the same versatile material as the webs. Simon could only assume that a considerable length of this material was tightly coiled inside the hand and could be utilized in different ways depending on what a task request called for. A very close look suggested that the pole which raised Pamela several feet from the surface of the desk was indeed formed of a singular thread circling round and round as it piled up on itself to create the height required. Even in the context of everything else he'd seen so far, this struck Simon as particularly incredible. He had no idea what the material was actually made of, but would certainly seek to find out in due course. For now, though, he was far too caught up in marveling at what Pamela 2.0 was capable of to get lost in the nuts and bolts of precisely how she was pulling it all off. Chapter 4. "Pamela, peel this potato," Simon requested. It was almost dinner time, with both breakfast and lunch having been cast aside while his total attention fell on Pamela, and a particularly sharp hunger pang reminded him of this preconceived test. As he issued the challenge, he produced a whole potato from a drawer under his desk, along with a peeler and a plate. This was a test he had come up with on his own, and the manner in which Pamela tackled it would tell him a lot about her problem-solving skills. Simon had no idea how he would have gone about peeling a potato with only one hand, and was greatly intrigued to watch from the best seat in the house as Pamela 2.0 tackled just that dilemma. 3 green fingernails came far more quickly than Simon expected, and the fact that they came at all was a surprise in itself. This was nothing compared to what came next, though, as Pamela's fingertips planted what seemed like the base of an adhesive web on the desk, and then proceeded to create a 3-dimensional object in the same rapid layer-by-layer manner in which she had set up the pole during Simon's photo challenge. The shape of this new object resembled the top of an egg cup, so it made a good degree of sense when Pamela lifted the potato and placed it in its purpose-built holder. From there, she picked up the peeler and began removing the skin like a seasoned chef, working in efficient strokes and only putting the peeler down to rotate the potato as necessary. The egg cup had been formed by a length of web-like material emitted solely from Pamela's pinky, which ensured that her more important fingers and thumb were free to conduct the peeling with minimal obstruction. When the potato was completely peeled, Pamela placed it directly in front of Simon before reeling the wonder web back in via her pinky's fingertip even more rapidly and astonishingly than she had produced it just a few minutes earlier. Simon grinned as the celebration rainbow flashed across her fingernails. Pamela prepared Simon's dinner, placing a packaged meal in the oven and cooking it to perfection with zero input from him beyond a verbal instruction of which meal to choose from the freezer. Like Pamela 1.0, the new iteration could read and meaningfully interpret novel information. Unlike her predecessor, Pamela 2.0 had the physical ability to act on it. She even opened a bottle of wine, securing it to the table with a line of adhesive web before deftly handling the cork, then poured it by temporarily securing the glass in a similar fashion. What had come to impress Simon almost as much as the webs themselves was how expertly Pamela avoided being tangled up in them or even obstructed at all. Her spatial awareness and depth perception skills were remarkable. That much was now as clear as day. When day turned to night, Simon had Pamela run him a perfect bath. She did this using yet another series of built-in sensors, in this case capable of gauging the temperature of the water. As he sat in the bathtub for the few minutes he could bear to be away from his new toy, Simon's mind got to wondering just how much could be accomplished by 2 Pamela 2.0s working in conjunction with each other. He couldn't immediately think of anything he'd like to try with 2 that hadn't been possible with 1, since Pamela had aced every test so far with a lot of help from the game-changing web feature. This had been kept quiet by GTN and would be the big exclusive reveal in Simon's review, one he was keener than ever to share with the world. Simon played with Pamela for several more hours before heading to bed, including a long while spent literally playing with her as the two tossed a baseball back and forth. Pamela leaned back on her rollerball to create momentum and threw the ball to Simon with more power than he could offer in return. When it came to catching, she never missed through any fault of her own, only failing to catch the ball if Simon majorly messed up by letting it slip out of his hand or something of that nature. Whenever Simon made a poor but salvageable throw, Pamela reacted by dashing into perfect position. Even if it was too high, she proved herself able to spring upwards using a ceiling-projected web. This all happened so quickly, in mere fractions of a second, that it really highlighted the processing power at work in regard to her judgment of a throw's pace and trajectory, let alone the precise projection of her web. Like each test before it, this game of catch showed off new skills and gave Simon a better grasp of just how great the true limits of Pamela 2.0's abilities might be. Less outwardly impressive, but perhaps as useful as anything else, was the ease and speed with which Pamela understood requests Simon made with deliberately imperfect grammar and diction, suggesting that a truly novel kind of instant language interpretation was at play. Unlike with digital assistants of the past and present, no slow instructions or careful pronunciations were ever needed, much less any repetition. There was by now no doubt in Simon's mind that Pamela 2.0 represented a real step into the long-promised future of consumer technology. When exhaustion hit at around 4 a.m., Simon went to bed a happy man. He set an alarm for 7 a.m. and woke up even happier, excited for his second day with the world's most sought-after gadget. Shortly after he finished eating a breakfast that Pamela prepared to perfection, however, the trajectory of Simon's test run was dramatically altered. As it had the previous day, everything began with the chiming of a two-tone doorbell. And once again, Charles the doorman stood on the other side. "Flowers?" Simon asked in surprise as Charles held them out. "You know Caitlin doesn't like to—" "They're for you," Charles smiled. "From Caitlin." Simon was even more confused now, but tried not to let it show. There was something more than a little odd about the idea of Caitlin sending him flowers for the first time in all the years they'd been together, but none of it had anything to do with Charles. More to the point, it wasn't worth losing time with Pamela over something like this. But as soon as Charles was gone, after even less small talk than usual given Simon's reluctant insistence that he wasn't allowed to talk about the test run at all, an all too familiar movement in the doorway across the hall caught Simon's eye. Like the day before, Joe Poole's door was cracked open just enough to bring the teenager's prying eye into view. Altogether unlike the previous day, though, Joe opened the door fully as soon as he was sure Charles was gone. He didn't say a word, but held his hands together in a praying gesture while mouthing "wait" and staring at Simon with wide eyes. He then reached down to his side and produced a large sheet of paper from the floor. A message was scribbled on it in messy handwriting. "Don't speak, just come in. I need to show you something about the hand." Simon's eyebrows furrowed in undisguised confusion. There was no annoyance or frustration, just total and unadulterated bewilderment. He had literally no idea what was going on. Undeterred, Joe then flipped the card around to reveal a second side with an even more curious message. This time, the impact of his written words was further heightened by the unusual paleness of his face and the unease in his expression. "Pamela is not what you think. Please, we don't have much time." Chapter 5. Too perplexed by Joe's written statements to ignore them, Simon placed his flowers on the marble floor and stepped across the hallway. "What the hell are you trying to pull?" he snapped at the teenager, for whom he'd held nothing but contempt for as long as he could remember. Joe implored Simon to go back and close his door all the way, bringing a silencing finger to his lips as he gestured with the other hand. "She can hear us," he mouthed. By now, Simon's last threads of patience were wearing thin. Only the troubled look on Joe's face made him follow the instruction, because either the kid was the best actor in the world, or he really had discovered something. Simon didn't speak as he closed his own door and eventually entered Joe's, walking into a luxury unit that was identical in size and layout to his own. The decor wasn't a million miles away either, and the symmetry was complete when Joe led the way to a crowded workstation in the equivalent spot to his own office. Simon looked around at an eclectic range of framed items and computer accessories. The setup of the room clearly suggested that Joe was heavily into online gaming and spent a lot of time in his chair, but there were also some framed basketball jerseys and family photos. The desk featured an enormous curved screen, as big as any Simon had ever seen in real-world use, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the area on the right, which was currently being used as one of 4 distinct monitors. On it, he saw a live video feed of his own kitchen. "Hear me out," Joe begged, correctly sensing that Simon was about to turn towards him with rage in his eyes. "It's not me. It's her." "You little—" "Think what you want, dude," Joe interrupted. "But Caitlin's not even home. Why would I spy on you, and why would I bring you in here to see it? Think about it. Just hear me out. There was a huge spike in nearby data traffic as soon as that thing arrived yesterday morning. I started looking into it, and you're not going to believe what I found." Still reeling from such a colossal invasion of privacy as live footage from his own home streamed into this untrustworthy teenager's gaming den, Simon considered that he'd come this far and might as well listen to the rest of it. "The whole point is that Pamela is supposed to operate offline, right?" Joe asked. "That's a selling point. She only connects once a month to check your subscription is still active and to download firmware updates." Simon nodded, furrowing his brow as he slowly began to see at least part of what Joe was getting at. "I didn't connect her to my Wi-Fi, and there's not supposed to be any data upload going on." Joe took a seat in his gaming chair and navigated to a screen full of white text. "She's been transmitting everything to this IP address since the moment you pressed the activation button. I traced the address to GTN's HQ in Dallas. They've been getting full video, full audio, everything. But it gets crazier than that." The exposed feeling was now like a film on Simon's skin, one he wished he could peel off and discard, and the fact that the responsible party was a multinational corporation rather than a lone creep made it even worse. A large part of him didn't even want to know how much crazier it could possibly get, but there was no way out of this mess without going further in. "What I've done here is intercept the comms between the Hand and the GTN team in Dallas," Joe went on. "And the part I haven't told you yet is that those comms are two-way. Every time you've assigned a task, they've been determining whether she can do it on her own or whether they had to step in. Like your dinner last night. She didn't know how to work your oven. She did read the cooking instructions on the meal packaging and made sense of that on her own, but your oven's control panel wasn't in her database. Look, we can actually see the traffic, surprisingly easily decrypted, and we can see exactly when they've issued direct instructions. It's almost like they were remotely piloting her." Simon blew air from his lips. The physical abilities of Pamela 2.0 were still remarkable. She had performed the tasks, after all. But this bombshell news of direct intervention from GTN HQ shattered many of his illusions. As a lifelong tech enthusiast, he felt disappointment that there hadn't been as colossal a leap forward in AI as he believed. But as a human being, he felt fury at being lied to and surveilled. Pamela 2.0 hadn't been dynamically solving all of the challenges Simon threw at her using unprecedented artificial intelligence. On the contrary, her performance of some of the more complex and multi-stage tasks had been remotely assisted and perhaps even controlled by experts in a Texas-based lab. "Why were you even looking at all this?" Simon asked, feeling justified in directing some of his anger at Joe. "Do you just sit here in your cave, eavesdropping on our data signals and looking for spikes?" Joe shook his head. "Never. It's not like that. You're not the only one around who worries about bugs and other security threats, dude. My dad's an important man, and he trusts me to keep on top of that stuff. My system alarms went haywire a few minutes after I saw you at the door yesterday morning, right when the Hands started communicating with their team in Texas. I've been sitting on this since yesterday afternoon when I first cracked it. I had to figure out a way to get you in here without that thing realizing we're on to her. I couldn't knock at the door or tell you out loud, so I had to set up the flowers and be there when they arrived so you would see me." The story had an internal logic to it, and Simon more or less accepted it. There were bigger fish to fry right now in any case, and the details around this part could wait. "Can you come over and put this stuff on my computer?" he asked. "The test is over. The world has to know what they've tried to pull here. They were obviously willing to do whatever it takes to make sure I wrote a good review, even if it meant flat out lying and trying to con me about Pamela's intelligence. People have to know." "Wait, you want me to come into your place?" Joe said, wondering if he'd misunderstood. Simon answered by walking to the door. "I'll be watching you like a hawk." Joe forced a nod. "Of course. And hey, listen, I'm sorry about that whole elevator thing a few years ago. I was just, she's Caitlin Judd, dude." "What's done is done," Simon said. "You can start making up for it by helping me expose those liars at GTN for what they are. Deal?" Joe gratefully accepted Simon's offer of a handshake, then followed him into the hallway. Just a few seconds later, though, as soon as they reached Simon's living room, both men got the distinct feeling that something wasn't right. Did I imagine you opening those blinds an hour ago?" Joe asked. Simon gulped. Sure enough, the blackout blinds were down, and rather than by sunlight, the apartment was now artificially lit by overhead bulbs, like the one Pamela had so impressively replaced the previous day. Simon scanned the room and felt a flood of relief when he saw Pamela sitting on the kitchen counter where he'd left her. Maybe there was some mundane explanation, he thought, rather than anything untoward. As he walked over to pick up the device and return it to the docking station in his office, however, Simon then felt his spine stiffen. The lack of detail gave it away, the lack of artificial veins and light wrinkles. He was looking at Pamela, but he was looking at Pamela 1.0. "It's a decoy," he said, shakily forcing the words from his dry mouth. "Joe, she got the old model out to distract us from whatever else she's—" "Dude," Joe said, tugging Simon's sleeve to direct his attention back to the doorway. There, they saw that the spider-like hand had scaled the door and was in the process of turning its key to lock them inside. Before either could even think of what to do, much less do it, Pamela rapidly scampered across the wall. She then flicked the light switch and plunged the apartment into absolute darkness. Chapter 6. Simon Biker's heart was racing a mile a minute, and the appearance of 3 green fingernails did nothing to ease his concerns. The glow of Pamela's nails punctured the darkness, relaying that she had both received and understood a new instruction from afar. Given that other recent instructions clearly included turning off the lights and locking the 2 men inside, neither Simon nor Joe had any illusions that this could be good. Pamela 2.0 was there to get a good review by any means necessary, and her creators in Dallas were going to ensure she succeeded. It all happened so fast that Simon and Joe never stood a chance. In a rapid burst of motion, Pamela propelled herself between walls and surfaces with the speed of a rubber ball and the purpose of an assassin. The men found themselves physically bound together, trapped in a web of material with incredible tensile strength, wrapped so tightly and thickly that there was quite simply no way out. The worst physical feeling of Simon's life came moments later when Pamela used the web's adhesive properties to seal his lips shut and prevent him from calling out in a desperate cry for help. Joe's calls were similarly muffled almost immediately, and with that their hopes were extinguished. They could only watch in helpless horror as the green lights on Pamela's fingernails reappeared every now and again, always followed by the sound of her performing some action or another. The worst sound came when the men heard her opening the oven and then engaging the gas. This brought an unwelcome break in the absolute darkness, simultaneously foreshadowing the eternal darkness that seemed certain to lie in their immediate futures. Pamela's green lights then zoomed around the doorframe and window vents, sealing off the apartment's oxygen supply and condemning the men to their fate. Simon instinctively believed there was no way GTN could possibly get away with this or concoct a plausible story for why Joe would be in his apartment, but a rueful consideration of the resources at their disposal and the level of desperation they clearly had in ensuring their lies about Pamela 2.0 weren't exposed gave him second thoughts. They wouldn't be doing it if they didn't think they could get away with it, he lamented, and with neither Caitlin nor Joe's father due home from their respective European business trips for at least a week, they had more than enough time to think of something and carry it out. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Simon that he was perhaps a victim of his own fame, with the influence he held in the online tech world having been deemed so important that GTN was willing to stage a gas leak and kill 2 men to ensure the product on which the company had staked its future wouldn't suffer from anything less than a glowing review. Joe Poole, for his part, was experiencing stomach-churning regret over having opted to get involved in the first place. "No good deed goes unpunished," he lamented, not even taking any solace that he would at least die having set foot in Caitlin Judd's apartment. Pamela disappeared into Simon's office as both his nose and Joe's fought a losing battle against an increasingly pungent smell of gas, and neither man would ever see her lights or any others again. On the other side of the office door, Pamela crawled up Simon's desk and positioned herself on his keyboard. Balancing on the dynamic gyroscopic ball under her cut-off wrist, the miraculous hand lowered her fingers to the keys and began to type. The faint clicking of keys that carried through the otherwise silent apartment was anything but soothing to Simon, who knew exactly what was happening. "Well, guys," the hand typed, following direct instructions from afar. "I expected the world, and she gave me the galaxy. Pamela 2.0 is the robotic breakthrough we've all been waiting for, and no home is going to be complete without her. I hardly even know where to start." Thank you for listening to Pamela 2.0. Written by Craig A. Falconer. Narrated by Connor Brannigan. Text copyright 2020 by Craig Falconer. Production copyright 2021 by Craig Falconer. All rights reserved.